My name is Logan, and I'm 19 years old, just trying to figure life out. I live with my dad, Thomas, an architect who's always busy with his work, caught up in projects. I lost my mum when I was young, so for a long time, it was just me and my father. That changed a few years ago when he remarried. Her name is Amelia, and she's nothing like the stepmom I imagined. She's young, smart, and feels more like a friend than a mother to me. But recently things have gotten complicated. Let me tell you about the day that changed everything. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep sharing more fascinating true stories like this one. Don't forget to watch this video till the end, because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. It all began like any other peaceful afternoon. My dad was away for work and Amelia was out running errands, leaving me home alone. I don't mind being alone. I'm used to it by now. I spent the afternoon in my room, lounging and scrolling on my phone. The house was so quiet, with no sounds at all. I had just finished my shower, still damp, and was lying on my bed, absorbed in my phone. It was quiet, too quiet. The house felt still, almost unsettling. I tried to shake off the feeling but couldn't ignore it. That's when I heard a soft knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to put on a shirt, but I hesitated. Who could be at the door? Before I could react, the door creaked open. It was Amelia standing there, her eyes locked on mine in a way I hadn't seen before. She was casually dressed in a light sweater and jeans, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She seemed unsure, as if she was waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. I was completely caught off guard. "Sorry," she said softly, her voice gentle yet carrying an unexpected tension. I didn't mean to interrupt. I immediately jumped up, trying to grab my shirt, but something in her expression stopped me. She wasn't angry or upset. She was just watching me. Her gaze lingered on me, and it felt like everything had shifted in that moment. "Amelia," I stammered, my heart racing. "I wasn't expecting anyone." She didn't say anything at first. She just stepped into the room slowly, like the space between us had changed. She took another step closer, and I froze, my pulse pounding. I felt exposed, not just physically, but emotionally as well. My mind raced. Should I apologize? Should I ask her to leave? But before I could make a move, she spoke again. "You should have locked the door," she said, her voice soft, but there was something more behind it. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't take my eyes off her. There was something pulling us together that I couldn't understand, making it hard to breathe. She was so close now that I could feel the warmth of her body. It was overwhelming. I wanted to speak, but couldn't. Then, before I even realized it, my hand reached out toward hers, trembling slightly. She didn't pull away. Her gaze never left mine, and it felt like she was giving me permission, as though she was waiting for me to take the first step. I moved closer, my body moving almost on its own. Her eyes were locked on mine as I reached up and gently touched her face, my fingers brushing against her soft skin. The connection between us was undeniable. The tension between us was suffocating. Just as I leaned in, ready to kiss her, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted the moment. Amelia quickly stepped back, her face flushed. "We can't," she whispered. "This isn't right." I stood frozen, my heart pounding. She was right, and we both knew it, but I couldn't deny what had just happened. Something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure I could pretend nothing had changed. Before I could say anything, she glanced toward the door, then back at me. "We'll talk later," she said quickly before turning and leaving the room. Her footsteps faded down the hallway. I stood there in shock, unable to process what had just occurred. Part of me felt relieved, but another part wanted to follow her, to understand what it all meant. I sat back down on my bed, my mind racing. Nothing felt the same anymore. The next few days dragged on, like I was walking through a fog. I couldn't stop thinking about Amelia. What had happened wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was something more. The way she looked at me, the way she seemed to breathe faster when we were close, it all felt too real to ignore. But the worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. My friends wouldn't understand, and my dad definitely wouldn't. Amelia was still my stepmom. We both knew it was wrong, but the tension between us was impossible to escape. I tried to distance myself, telling myself it was just a moment of weakness that we'd both move past. But every time I saw her, I couldn't ignore the way her gaze lingered just a little too long. It was like she was waiting for something, but I wasn't sure what. One evening, after dinner, my dad was working late, and I was sitting on the couch flipping through the channels when Amelia walked into the room. She was wearing a loose sweater and leggings, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She looked different, more distant, but also somehow more attractive. "Hey," she said, sitting beside me on the couch, "mind if I join you?" My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. "No, of course not," I replied, my voice betraying my nervousness. She sat close, her shoulder brushing mine. I could feel the warmth of her body, and I had to force myself not to think about the moment in my room. We sat in silence for a while, but the air between us felt heavy, filled with unspoken words. I could feel her presence more than I could focus on the TV. Then she spoke softly. "About the other day," she said. I stiffened. I wasn't sure if I was ready to talk about it. "Amelia," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what happened. I don't know why we—" She interrupted me, brushing her hand over mine. The touch was electric, like a spark in the air. She didn't pull away, her fingers gently tracing the lines of my hand. "I know it's complicated," she whispered, barely audible, "but I can't stop thinking about it, about you." My heart was racing, my ears ringing. I'd never heard her say anything like that before. It felt like time had stopped, leaving just the two of us. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She was just as conflicted as I was, maybe more. But there was something else. A deep yearning, a desire that was impossible to ignore. "Amelia," I said, my voice shaky, "I don't know what to do. I don't know what this is, but I can't stop thinking about you either." She leaned in, her lips almost brushing my ear. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," she whispered. "Can we?" I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to pull away, to tell her it was wrong, but the truth was I didn't want to. I didn't want to deny how I felt. Before I could say anything, she closed the distance between us, kissing me gently at first. It was the softest, most tentative kiss I'd ever had. I froze, my whole body still. The world seemed to fade as I kissed her back. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened and the tension between us crackled in the air. Her lips were warm and soft, and I felt something I couldn't name, a deep longing to be closer to her, to lose myself in the moment. But just as quickly she pulled back, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't do this, Logan," she whispered. "It's wrong." I didn't know what to say. A part of me knew she was right, but another part didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't stop wanting her. "Amelia," I said, my voice low, "I don't care. I just need you." She looked at me, her gaze softening, but then she looked away, regret written all over her face. "I can't," she said, trembling. "I can't do this to your dad, to you." I understood, but it didn't make it any easier. I wanted her more than anything, but the consequences of crossing that line were too much to bear. She quickly stood up, running a hand through her hair in frustration. "We need to stop," she said firmly. "This can't happen again." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me in the quiet living room, my heart racing and my mind spinning from everything that had just happened. The silence felt suffocating. I sat there completely still, trying to process everything. Part of me wanted to follow Amelia, to talk to her, but I knew it was a bad idea. I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss, the way she felt in my arms, the warmth of her body against mine. It was as if I was addicted to the feeling, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the guilt creeping in. I had always looked up to my dad, trusted him, and now here I was, about to betray him in the worst way possible. I tried to distract myself, but it was useless. Every time I saw Amelia, I felt that same pull, that same connection. It wasn't just physical, it felt deeper, like something I couldn't escape. It was as if every part of me was drawn to her, even though I knew it was wrong. A few days later, I found myself in the kitchen making breakfast. The house was quiet, the only sound the sizzle of bacon in the pan. I hadn't seen Amelia yet, but I knew she'd be up soon. My heart raced just thinking about her. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't go away. The memory of our kiss, the way I felt when she was near, it was overwhelming. Just as I was finishing setting the plates, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Amelia standing in the doorway, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, dressed casually in a blouse and jeans. To me, though, she might as well have been wearing a dress made of fire. "Good morning," she said softly. But there was an underlying tension in her voice that matched what I was feeling inside. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound calm even though my heart was pounding. She stepped closer, her eyes briefly scanning the food on the table before looking back at me. There was a moment of silence, a heavy pause in the air. Then she spoke again. "You've been avoiding me," she said, her tone barely a whisper. It wasn't a question, it felt more like an accusation. I froze. Had it been that obvious? Was I really avoiding her? "I'm not avoiding you," I stammered, but deep down I knew I was. It was hard to face her after everything that had happened. But the truth was, every part of me wanted to reach out to her, to feel that connection again. She took a step closer, and I could smell her perfume, a soft mix of jasmine. It made my head spin. "You know this isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We can't keep doing this, Logan." I wanted to respond, to tell her that I couldn't stop how I felt, that I didn't want to fight it anymore. But instead, I just stood there, frozen, my heart torn between what was right and what I wanted more than anything. "I don't know how to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Amelia's expression softened, but there was sadness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She reached out, brushing her hand lightly against my arm. The touch sent a wave of emotion through me. "You have to stop, Logan," she said quietly, her eyes searching mine. "This isn't just about us. It's about your dad, too. It's about everything we've built. Do you really want to destroy that?" Her words hit me hard like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I realized what was at stake. My dad, the man who had always been there for me, who had worked so hard for us. How could I betray him like this? But even then, the pull I felt toward Amelia didn't fade. It was still there, urging me to give in. I could feel the battle rising inside me between my heart and my conscience. "I don't know if I can," I said bitterly. "I don't know how to stop feeling this way about you." Amelia sighed deeply, her hand falling to her side. "You have to. For your sake, for mine, and for your dad," she said. Her words were like a cold shower, waking me up to the reality of what I was doing. I couldn't keep chasing something that was never meant to be. I couldn't keep risking everything for a fleeting moment of passion. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "I just don't know what to do anymore." "You don't have to do anything," Amelia replied softly. "Just let it go. We have to let it go." Her words cut through the tension, and I finally understood. I was on the verge of making a decision that could tear everything apart. I couldn't do that. Not to my dad, not to her, and not to myself. With a heavy heart, I nodded. "Okay," I whispered. "We'll stop. We have to stop." But as I turned back to face her, the look in her eyes told me we both knew this wasn't over. The feelings hadn't disappeared. The temptation would still be there, waiting for us to slip. But in that moment, I knew that if we didn't stop now, we would never be able to fix the mess we were about to create, and I wasn't ready to live with that kind of regret. My name is Ava Parker. I'm 24 years old and live in a modest apartment right in the heart of the city. It's hard to describe myself, but maybe ordinary is the best word. I work at a graphic design company, and on weekends I often end up watching reruns of old TV shows, wondering if this is all that life really has to offer. It doesn't sound very exciting, does it? But if there's one thing that truly stands out about me, it's my troubled relationship with my mother, Claire Parker, or more accurately, the lack of one. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep sharing fascinating real stories like this one, and don't forget to watch until the end and hit the like button if you find this story interesting. Please show your support by clicking like. Claire has always been more focused on herself than anyone else. She's beautiful, full of energy, and magnetic. The type of woman who walks into a room and instantly captures everyone's attention. Growing up, I admired her, wishing to be like her. But as I got older, that admiration turned into resentment, as I realized how little she truly cared about anyone but herself. It's hard not to sound bitter, but that's just how it was. Claire wasn't the type of mother who made school lunches or asked about your day. Instead, she was the one throwing extravagant parties and ignoring your birthday. She moved from one relationship to another as quickly as she changed outfits, always looking for the next man to give her the attention she craved. That's how Thomas came into our lives. I was 16 when Claire married him, her fourth husband. He was calm and grounded, a solid presence in the chaos of her life. At first, I didn't know what to think of him. He was quiet, but confident, kind, yet distant. Unlike the others, he wasn't showy or trying to impress anyone. He was steady and reliable, and after witnessing my mother's tumultuous love life, that was a refreshing change. Thomas treated me with a respect I wasn't used to. He took an interest in my hobbies, encouraged me to follow my dreams, and even stood up to Claire when she dismissed my aspirations. He became the father figure I had always wanted, and for the first time, I felt like someone truly cared about me. As I got older, however, my feelings toward Thomas began to shift. It wasn't sudden, and I didn't even notice it at first, but looking back, I realize how my admiration slowly transformed into something deeper. The way he smiled at me over dinner, how his hand lingered on my shoulder a moment too long, the softness in his eyes when he looked at me. I convinced myself it meant nothing. He was my stepfather after all, and he loved Claire. But the truth was, Claire didn't appreciate him. She took him for granted, just as she did everything else. Then came the betrayal that turned everything upside down. Ethan, my boyfriend of 3 years, was someone I had met in college. We fell in love and made plans for our future, or at least I thought we did. When I found out he had been cheating on me, it felt like my world had shattered. I spent days crying in bed, wondering where I had gone wrong. But as the pain started to fade, it was replaced by something else. Anger. Not just at Ethan, but at my mother. Claire had always been quick to criticize me, to point out my flaws and to compare me to herself. She had a way of making me feel like I could never measure up to her. And now, sitting in my small apartment nursing a broken heart, I realized I was done letting her win. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew where I wanted to be. I texted Claire to tell her I'd be coming over for dinner. She was thrilled, of course, but not because she missed me. She loved being the perfect hostess. When I arrived at the house, it felt like I had stepped into another world. The sophisticated decor, the polished floors, and the subtle scent of lavender. Everything about it was different from my apartment. But what struck me most was Thomas. He greeted me warmly, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that made my heart tighten. Claire was already busy in the kitchen, distracted by her latest project, so Thomas and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The silence between us was comfortable, but filled with an unspoken charge. As the evening went on, I couldn't help but notice the way Thomas looked at me. It wasn't inappropriate, but it wasn't indifferent either. There was a tenderness in his gaze, an intensity that made my heart race. What started innocently, a touch on the arm, a lingering glance, a shared laugh, grew into something more. With every moment, I felt myself drawn to him in a way that confused and unsettled me. The turning point came one night when Claire went to bed early, leaving Thomas and me alone. We sat together on the couch, the warm glow from the fireplace casting shadows across the room. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, probably something trivial, but I do remember the way he looked at me. It was as though he saw through me, past all the anger and the walls I had built around myself. His gaze was steady and unwavering, making me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on his. He didn't pull away. The kiss was slow, tentative, both a question and an answer at once. His lips were warm, his touch gentle, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. The kiss lingered in my mind long after it ended, like a fire had been ignited inside me, chasing away the pain and rejection that had consumed me. But it wasn't just the kiss itself. It was the way Thomas looked at me afterward. There was no hesitation, no judgment, just a quiet intensity that made my pulse race. I pulled back slightly, my breath unsteady, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His hand was still on mine, warm and steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, a backdrop to the emotions that hung between us. I should have felt guilty. I should have been overwhelmed with shame or fear, but instead I felt an odd sense of belonging, as though I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Thomas's thumb brushed across the back of my hand in a small, tender gesture that sent shivers down my spine. I looked up at him, searching his eyes for reassurance, for some sign that this wasn't a mistake. Without a word, he leaned in again. This kiss was different, not hesitant or unsure, but deliberate, filled with a passion that left me breathless. His hands moved to my face, firm yet gentle, and I melted into him, allowing the moment to consume me. When we finally parted, my head was spinning. My mind screamed at me to say something, to acknowledge what had just happened, but the words seemed insufficient. Instead, I rested my forehead against his, my eyes closing as I tried to catch my breath. I opened my mouth to speak, but he silenced me with a gentle shake of his head. His hand slid down to my shoulder, and I felt a warmth spreading through me that I hadn't experienced in years. It was a deep connection, a sense of being truly seen and valued, in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. The next morning, I woke up to a storm of emotions inside me. Part of me wanted to stay in that moment forever, to remain in the safety and warmth of Thomas's arms. But another part of me was terrified. What had I done? What did this mean for us, for me, for him, and for Claire? I avoided Claire that day, making excuses to retreat to my apartment, but the truth was, I couldn't face her. Not yet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas's face, felt the heat of his kiss, and my heart ached with the weight of what we had started. Later that evening, Thomas texted me with a simple message. "Are you okay?" It was a small gesture, but it made my chest tighten. He cared. He always had. And now that care had grown into something I couldn't ignore. The following days were a blur of stolen glances and fleeting touches. I found excuses to visit the house when Claire wasn't around. Every time we were alone, the tension between us grew, a subtle pull bringing us closer. One evening, after Claire had gone to bed early, I found myself sitting with Thomas on the back porch. The air was cool, the scent of freshly cut grass mixing with the soft aroma of the wine we had been drinking. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar. I leaned against him, resting my head on his shoulder, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. What we shared was intoxicating, yet fragile. We were cautious, aware of the lines we were crossing, but no matter how much we tried to deny it, our connection only grew stronger. One night, as a summer storm raged outside, I found myself standing with Thomas in the kitchen. The lights flickered briefly, and thunder rumbled in the distance. For a moment, the tension between us was nearly unbearable. He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the counter. I turned to face him, my breath catching in my throat as our eyes locked. Without thinking, I closed the gap between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was desperate yet tender. The rain beat against the windows, a rhythmic sound accompanying the passion that unfolded between us. His arms enveloped me, pulling me close, and the world outside disappeared. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Claire, the consequences, the uncertainty of the future, all that mattered was the way he made me feel wanted, cherished, and alive. As the weeks passed, our relationship deepened. We found ways to steal moments together, each one filled with passion and vulnerability. Thomas became my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of my life. But with every stolen kiss and whispered word, the weight of our actions grew heavier. I began to notice the cracks in our carefully constructed facade. Though Claire remained oblivious, I knew it was only a matter of time before she found out. Despite the growing risks, I couldn't let go. Thomas was more than just a lover. He was my anchor. He made me feel whole in a way I had never felt before. The weeks following that kiss during the storm were a blur of longing and stolen moments. Each encounter with Thomas grew more charged, more desperate. I would wake up in the middle of the night, replaying every touch, every whispered word, wondering how we had ended up here. It wasn't just physical. Just Thomas understood me in a way no one else ever had. He listened when I spoke about my dreams, my fears, and the pain of growing up in Claire's shadow. He saw me, not as Claire's daughter, not as someone broken by heartache, but as me. That kind of understanding was intoxicating. It made me feel alive, wanted, and cherished in a way I had never felt before. But it was also terrifying. Every time we were together, I felt the weight of the risks we were taking. The line between right and wrong was fragile. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of purple, I found myself alone with Thomas in the garden. Claire had gone out to meet friends, leaving the house in eerie silence. Thomas was tending to the roses that Claire loved but never cared for. I watched him from the patio, noticing the grace with which he worked, the way the fading light softened his features. Without knowing why, I found myself walking toward him. My heart raced as he looked up. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes that made my breath catch. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his, and in that moment, the world seemed to slow. He set down the shears he had been holding, and without saying anything, reached for me. His hands rested gently on my waist, pulling me closer, and his lips found mine in a slow, deliberate kiss. Every movement was filled with tenderness, and I felt myself weakening, as if the garden around us and the world itself had faded away. There were no words about what was happening, no labels, no promises. But there was a silent understanding between us. Whatever this was, it was ours. I began to cherish those moments together, the times we could let our guards down and simply be. Every interaction felt electric, as if we were breaking every rule. But as our bond deepened, so did the danger. I began to notice the small signs, Claire's curious looks, her casual comments about how much time Thomas and I were spending together. She didn't know, of course, but a part of me wondered if she suspected something. One afternoon, while I was sketching designs for work, Claire entered the living room. Her eyes scanned me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You've been coming over a lot lately," she said, her voice casual but edged with something else. I shrugged, keeping my focus on my sketchbook. "It's nice to get out of my apartment," I replied nonchalantly. She didn't say anything else, but the look she gave me lingered long after she left. It was inevitable that our secret would be discovered. Claire might have been too self-absorbed to notice all the signs, but she wasn't blind. One evening, as I was leaving the house, Thomas walked me to the door. Claire had gone upstairs to prepare for one of her events, and the house was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Thomas leaned in, brushing his hand against mine in a way that made my skin tingle. "Drive safe," he murmured softly. I nodded, my heart racing as I stepped outside. But as I turned to close the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of Claire standing at the top of the stairs. Her expression was unreadable. The days that followed were tense, heavy with an unspoken weight. Claire didn't confront me directly, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Thomas and I became more cautious, but the bond between us was impossible to hide. Then one night, everything came crashing down. "Do you think I don't see what's going on?" Claire's voice was sharp as she pulled me into the living room. Her eyes burned with a fury I had never seen before. She didn't need to say much. I knew she had figured it out. "You think I didn't notice the way you look at him? The way he looks at you? You're both disgusting." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. What could I say? I had betrayed her in the worst possible way. But even as she screamed at me, even as she called me every name in the book, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. I had finally crossed the line that had been drawing me in for so long. From that moment on, nothing was ever the same. I moved out of the house, but the impact of my relationship with Thomas lingered. Every time I saw Claire, I saw the disappointment in her eyes. Every time I saw Thomas, I felt the weight of the secret we were still keeping. But through it all, I couldn't deny the connection we shared. It was a connection that had changed me, that had opened my eyes to what was possible when you let yourself truly feel. And though our relationship was tangled in lies and deceit, I couldn't bring myself to regret it, because for the first time in my life I had felt truly seen.